it's my great privilege to introduce, I would call her Professor Catherine Coray, to give her her full title. And I'm going to put on my glasses despite my ability to see a little bit better. So Catherine has taught at NYU Tisch School of the Arts since 1991 and has taught and collaborated with artists in Austria, Belarus, Chile, Cuba, Egypt, and Lebanon. As an actor, she worked regionally and off-Broadway with directors such as Anne Bogart and Andre Gregory. She was the director of the LARC Middle East U.S. Playwright Exchange. She curated and co-produced Arab Voices, Here, There, Then, Now in Abu Dhabi in 2016, Arab Voices, Stories of Palestine, Beirut, 2018, and Arab Voices, 3 new dramatic texts from Beirut and Berlin at the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute in New York City in 2019. Catherine serves on the advisory boards of several institutions, including the Georgetown Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, the Artistic Advisory Council for Playwrights, Horizons, and the Communications Arts Division of Lebanese American University. Welcome, Catherine, and thank you so much for this. And now I will turn it over to her.
Okay, thank you so much. It is such a delight to be in conversation with these people. I feel like they're my family, and so it's always a great opportunity to be in the room together, even the Zoom room. I want to start by introducing each of the panelists, starting with Kathryn Haddad. Kathryn is a writer, teacher, and community organizer whose work explores contemporary Arab American experiences and reflects on the political reality of life for Arabs and Americans. She is the co-founder and executive and artistic director of New Arab American Theater Works based in Minneapolis. Kathryn is a 2004-05 recipient of the Archibald Bush Leadership Fellowship for her work with the Arab American community. She is a recipient of the 2018 Kay Sexton Award from the Minnesota Book Awards and was a 2019-20 Jerome Artist Fellow in Playwriting. She is a published author and frequent speaker on issues relating to community organizing and Arab American arts. Kathryn was the co-founder and artistic executive director of MISNA Arab Arts Organization, where she served for 12 years. She has taught high school for over 25 years and serves on the board of the Loft Literary Center and as part of the steering committee of the National Middle East North African Theater Makers Alliance. Welcome, Kathryn. Jamil Khoury is the co-founder and co-executive artistic director of Silk Road Rising, an art-making and arts service organization that shapes conversations around Asian, Middle Eastern, and Muslim Americans. A theater producer, playwright, essayist, and filmmaker, Khoury's work focuses on Middle Eastern themes and questions of diaspora. He is particularly interested in the intersections of culture, national identity, religion, and belonging. Currently, Khoury is launching a Polycultural Institute, a think and create tank that generates discourse and representation about polyculturalism and social cohesion. He's also developing a biennial theater festival called Road Less Traveled, which will debut in the fall of 2023. Khoury has received numerous awards over the years, including the 2017 University of Chicago Diversity Leadership Alumni Award, the 2015 Community Leader Award from the Association for Asian American Studies, and the 2013 Catherine V. Lamke Award from Actors Equity Association for promoting diversity and inclusion in the theater. Lameece Issaq is an actor, writer, and founding artistic director of the Obie-winning company Noor Theater. Lameece has appeared in several regional and off-Broadway theater productions, and most recently in Michael Salam's critically acclaimed film, Breaking Fast. Her full-length play, Food and Fadwa, premiered off-Broadway at New York Theater Workshop, a production she co-produced and starred in, and in which Variety magazine praised her performance as stunning. She also co-wrote the feature film Abe, starring Stranger Things actor Noah Schnapp, which premiered at the 2019 Sundance Film Festival. She is currently developing her solo play, A Good Day to Me, Not to You, a fictionalized story based on her time living in a woman's rooming house run by nuns. Food and Fadwa was part of the Arab Voices Festival in both Abu Dhabi and in Beirut, and was published in the anthology Contemporary Plays by Women of Color, 2nd edition. Michael Malek Najjar is an associate professor of theater arts with the University of Oregon. He holds a PhD in theater and performance studies from UCLA and an MFA in directing from York University. He is an associate member of the Stage Directors and Choreographers Society and the Dramatists Guild, and an alumnus of the British American Drama Academy, Lincoln Center Directors Lab, Directors Lab West, and RAWI Screenwriters Lab in Jordan. Among many publications, he authored Middle Eastern American Theater, Communities, Cultures, and Creators, an Arab American Drama, Film and Performance, a Critical Study, 1908 to the present. Arab American Drama. He edited 4 Arab American plays, works by Layla Buck, Jamil Khoury, Youssef El Gundi, and Lameece Issaq and Jay Cater. And he is the co-editor of 6 plays of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with Jamil Khoury and Cory Pond. He has directed main stage productions with many of the major Middle Eastern American theaters, including Scenes from 71 Years with Golden Thread Productions, Zafira and the Resistance with New Arab American Theater Works, and Semitic Commonwealth with Silk Road Rising. Welcome, everybody. Okay, here we are. Son of a gun, we made it. Excellent. I'd like to kind of start actually going through and just asking each of you to talk a little bit about the origins of some of your major contributions. So as an example, how did Noor Theater get started? How did Silk Road Rising start? The origins of Mizna and New Arab American Theater Works. And Malek, how did you get started? Let's start with you. As the leading chronicler of Middle Eastern and Arab American theater, how did that happen? And not to mention being, a director and a professor of theater, which are perspectives that you bring to your wonderful books. Can you tell us how you got started with all of that?
Well, thank you for your kind introduction, Catherine. It's a joy to be with all of you, my friends, my colleagues. Thank you, Akram and the Moise Khairallah Center. I have to tell you, it came from a place of frustration because when you are brought up as a theater maker in the United States, you don't read Arab plays or Arab American plays or Middle Eastern American plays. You rarely encounter them in your studies or even in the professional world. And so you'll end up having people say, oh, there is an Arab American theater or there is a Middle Eastern, what is that? And there's so much misinformation and misrepresentation. And I just got to a point where I thought, I feel I have to make an intervention here. So really it was on some level self-serving because I was tired of being the other and being the misunderstood other. And as I began to explore and learn more about my amazing colleagues who are with us today and others, I began to see that there's a very rich, body of work that is constantly being created. And as I continued to study, I looked all the way back and found out that our earliest Arab American writers like Khalil Gibran, Amin Faris Rihani, and Khair Naimi were all playwrights, in addition to being the sort of mystic novel poets that they've always been categorized as. So it was vital to me to tell that story and to remind people in this country that Arab Americans have been making vital contributions to literature and arts from the late 19th century to the present day. And if anything, it's only expanding and growing, and we need to continue to chronicle this work instead of having it end up on hard drives and in basements, not being archived or seen or published by universities and other presses. Wonderful,
brilliant. And Catherine, can you talk a little bit about, having been one of the co-founders of Mizna, which is an organization for which I have tremendous respect, and how you kind of moved from Mizna and, the sort of diversity of presentations that Mizna does, the journal, et cetera, and into starting a specifically Arab American theater company.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for inviting me. Thank you, Catherine and Akram. Well, I started out as a writer wanting to have my story be told and not seeing my story, similar to kind of what Malek was saying, not feeling frustrated that there were no places that I saw myself. I was an English major, starting to read even multicultural stories, which in the 90s was just kind of starting to be introduced into my educational experience. But there were no Arab American or Arab stories even in that even in that realm. And so feeling frustrated, I thought, I would really like to be able to gather these stories. They must exist. And I was starting to become politically active in the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee in the early 90s. Was really excited to meet people at a national level, at the national conventions. I was the president of our local chapter, and we started to publish a local newsletter. And I thought, in this newsletter, why not publish some poems and stories of our community? And so we started publishing a few stories, a few poems. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. There were more stories put in. More of my friends who I didn't know were writers, Arab Americans, were putting their stories in. I got involved with RAWI, the National Writers Organization. And finally, the National ADC said, you can't publish these things under our name without our permission. You need to send it to us. We need to review it because it's under our name, and then we will allow you or not allow you to publish it. Well, I was raising all the money to do it, doing all the work, and I thought, well, it doesn't really make sense to do it under the ADC name. Why not create a journal of our own, where we can actually solicit not only local people, not be like the ADC Minnesota, but a national literary Arab American journal where I can read the stories, and I can also participate in this literary community that I don't see. So I wanted to create something that I didn't have, and it was just really an amazing beginning, because we, in the first issue, we published Naomi Shihab Nye, we published Suhair Hamad, people who've become really, really big names in Arab American writing were sending us their stuff because there really wasn't a place. And so Mizna started out primarily as a literary journal. Then we found the power in presenting these stories out loud, not only reading them, but let's perform. And I've always been involved in theater since I was a little kid. Theater is my first love. I was in theater all through high school, came from an immigrant background family that said there's no way you can study theater in college. You need to go and, get a real, I wouldn't even ask. So I never pursued it, but on the side, it was always my love. And so it was a combination of, this love of literature, this wanting to see myself and my identity and my stories, and to find a community that I didn't know that birthed the literary journal of Mizna. A few years after we started to do the journal, I was talking with, some other writers who were also visual artists, and they're saying, why not do a film festival? And I think that's like a great idea. I would love to see Arab films because I hadn't seen those either. So we started a film festival, and this all happened, in the late 90s, early 2000s, before, September 11th, because everybody always thinks, oh, we were in reaction to September 11th. And I have to continuously clear that up to say, no, we were never in reaction to that. So then we started to, bring in people from out of town and try to develop our community with working to make our own work. I wrote a play that we did. It soon became an organization that grew bigger and bigger because out of necessity, and became wonderful. And I wasn't able to do my writing, which is what I wanted to do in the first place. I wanted to create a space where I could write, and I wasn't able to because I was just being an arts administrator. Plus I have a full-time job as a teacher too. And so that was taking all of my time. And I realized at a certain point that I want to write. That's really what I need to do. And I want to participate in theater. I want to concentrate and participate in theater. So I decided the best thing for me to do was to hand over Mizna to someone who could do it full time, because I could not, and to concentrate on my own writing, to develop theater, which was my first love because Mizna wasn't a theater company. And so that's where we are today. I mean, I don't want to take up I could talk for this whole time about myself, and we've got everybody to talk to, but it's just a very exciting life project that's so dear to my heart and who I am, and has been so much a part of me since I can't even, pinpoint since when.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Moving on to Jamil. Okay, Jamil, so first of all, tell us exactly when Silk Road opened.
Well, we definitely were in response to September 11th, 2001. And it was really that anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-South Asian backlash that quickly ensued and continues to play out to this very day in any number of ways. We knew that representation was to our detriment, because the representation that was out there was negative. It was not generated from within our communities. And by and large, there was this absence or this erasure on Chicago stages and American stages of Arab American stories. So, I often think of concentric circles or zoom in, zoom out. And, when we sort of happened upon the metaphor of the Silk Road, it probably functioned in our heads that we were starting with the Arab world, and then we were going to the broader Swana region, and then we were going to attach to South Asia and East Asia, via this geographic guide and this sort of metaphor for cultural interchange that is the Silk Road, and to look at what are the relationships, what are the connections between these peoples and cultures that were connected sort of pre-European imperialism, pre-European colonialism, and had relationships that were really about interdependence and a sharing of stories in addition to trade. And we thought, this is a really interesting way and helpful way about talking about complexity and talking about the kind of movement between cultures and the sharing that occurred, and then thinking about that in a very 21st century Chicago diasporic way. So we would essentially bring the Silk Road to Chicago, although I actually think Chicago is a Silk Road city if you look at seaways and railways and so forth and so on within a North American context. And center the voices of playwrights and playwrights who create protagonists who share their backgrounds or central characters. So we created a rule called the playwright protagonist imperative or alignment. Arab American playwright, Arab American protagonist, Indian American playwright, Indian American protagonist, so forth, so that you as an audience member were taking a journey with someone who was grappling with the angst of family and community and belonging and heritage and making sense of all of that, and Americanness and assimilation or integration. So we were interested in those kind of messy, complicated stories of fitting in, belonging, not belonging, and also the transnationalism that defines so many of our lives, that we are, both here and there, and that, we want a kind of fluidity between those worlds and a kind of adjacency between those worlds. And, I think that 18 years later, we've expanded into the digital realm, into video and film production, a robust educational program in Chicago public schools and senior centers and community centers. And COVID has certainly disrupted a lot, but we hope to be here for many more years to come and cooking up all sorts of plans.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. Lameece, I happily, luckily for me, was around when Noor came together and, have cheered your triumphs, including the winning of the Obie Award, and, saw Food and Fodwa 3 times. Okay. And, yeah. I did a post-show discussion after Food and Fodwa, actually. And so could you talk a little bit about the wonderful association with New York Theater Workshop, the Noor residency there, Food and Fodwa, and how it's grown from there?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine, and thank you for just being this massive, amazing bridge with many arms reaching and bringing us together all of the time. And thank you, Akram and the Khairallah Center. And it's so fun to listen to everyone's origin story and just everyone coming from a different place and how vital it is to this entire community. I mean, I started off as an actor. I got my MFA and I was sort of bouncing around New York, sort of aimless. And then I met this sort of fantastic group of people who were doing the New York Arab American Comedy Festival. And I just spent the summer in the Middle East. And my uncle was like noticing how aimless I was. And he was like, Ammo, why you don't go to law school? You will never be Sophia Loren. You can be like John Grisham. You can carry more than one watermelon. And I was like, I don't understand that. But I did end up carrying more than one watermelon because I started becoming a producer, writer, actor. Maybe not the watermelons he wanted me to carry. But being involved in sort of the comedy scene, you know, the sort of annual event where there were actors, writers, directors, and we weren't necessarily comics. There were comics as well. And it just started getting me writing. I didn't, you know, and it was a very low stakes way to start writing in New York City, right? You had this sort of natural audience, people came to see what we were doing. And then we just forged friendships out of that because it was so much fun. You know, at that time, whenever it was, I think they started in 2002. I think it was in response to 9/11. There was already a kind of a group of Arab American artists there who were starting to mobilize pre 9/11, and then 9/11 happened, and then, you know, everything sort of started to come together in a much more cohesive way. And I was sort of running around with this group of people, and there were all these sort of off-Broadway plays that were interested in exploring what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, you know, I started acting in those plays, or my friends were acting in those plays. And then you sort of had Nibras, which at the time was an Arab American theater collective with like Mahan Shahlawi and Najla Saeed and Layla Buck. And these were sort of pioneers of that space. And then they were in residence at New York Theater Workshop out of a conversation around, the Rachel Cory cancellation. There's this play about this white woman who goes to Palestine, and, you know, it was canceled. It came from England and it was canceled at New York Theater Workshop. And then sort of that group of people prompted this conversation with New York Theater Workshop, and they did this really excellent thing where they listened. And then that sort of disbanded. Those artists went off and did their own things. And then I started sort of writing a little bit more. And with Jacob Cater, who I'd met at the Arab American Comedy Festival, and we started writing Food and Fadwa as a sketch for the Arab American Comedy Festival, but it was a little bittersweet. So then we had the opportunity to do a reading of it with the Nibras New York Theater Workshop. They did a festival of Palestinian plays. So that conversation happened. We became a part of it. So it was like build, strange thing happened, conversation happened. You know, that as something that develops does. You never know how one thing is going to lead to the next. And then the play was sort of, you know, we'd written the sort of first act, got invited to some really lovely residencies with the workshop, New York Theater Workshop, which got us to develop the piece, which was really valuable because we got to work on it with several different writers and then our director. And then eventually Jim Nicola, who is the artistic director at New York Theater Workshop, not for much longer, sadly, said to me, you know, as we were developing this play, he said, you know, now that Nibras is sort of disbanding, we could really use some kind of Arab American presence. What could we do? What can I do? So I, you know, got together with Maha Shahlawi and another friend of mine, Nancy Vitale, and I said, what if we start something and do sort of a larger Middle Eastern sort of representation thing, which we're sort of switching into the Swana, using Swanamov in the Middle Eastern. So we wanted to include our Iranian friends and Armenian friends and sort of open up that idea. And we went to Jim with the idea, and he said, yes, I want to support this. Why don't you guys become a company in residence here? And how about if we produce Food and Fadwa? And why don't you guys raise like, I don't know, 80 grand? And I was like, I'm sorry, I have $10. What are you even talking? I had no idea what the hell, how anyone started to raise money. But it put us in a position where we had to go out and meet our community and write grants and learn things. So we started this really weird backwards kind of way. Then we had this production, and then we had to start over. We had to really sort of build up the company. So it happened out of community, out of difficult conversations, and out of this sort of fun, low stakes, let's represent ourselves through comedy beginning. That's how we got here, really, I think. So it's,
Wonderful.
you never know. Yeah.
Wonderful. God, y'all are amazing. So, you mentioned the word community, came out of community, and community is one of the things I wanted to talk about with all of you. So as an example, going back to Jamil, I just feel that everything I read about what you're doing, I'm on your mailing list, and I read about the various projects and so on. And I'm just going to quote you here. Your work centers hugely on the community in Chicago, particularly MENA Muslim Asian communities, and quote, on the intersections of culture, national identity, religion, and belonging. Can you talk a little bit about what that means on a daily basis, on the ground, so to speak?
Well, I think, we'd made a conscious decision early on to move away from what might be considered siloed thinking and really just embrace the fact that all of us embody multiple cultures and identities at any given time, and those meanings shift and they morph and transform. So it was this desire to look at relationships and to look at similarities. So not in any way, sorry, I have a phone ringing, not in any way denying differences, but certainly that search for common ground, that recognition that there are challenges and needs that unite any number of communities, and that the experiences of anti-Arab racism, of Islamophobia, do not exist in vacuums, and are tied to larger systemic processes and politics and so forth. So for us, community always took a very broad meaning and a very expansive meaning, and just wanting to bring in for that invite to be very broad, and the idea of bias about us for all was really key early on. And when I would hear from people who weren't of Arab origin or who weren't of what we call Silk Road backgrounds, who would come to a play and tell us, I'm fifth generation German American, and that was my story, or that was my mother's story, or that is so powerful and meaningful because it speaks to the relatability, and it speaks to the sort of intimacy of the work that people outside our communities can find themselves in our stories. So I think that we find communities that we're not always necessarily looking for. And conversely, we're not always embraced by the communities that we assume we will be embraced by. And that is a constant negotiation and navigation. And the fact that we have been able to develop an audience of people who are dedicated to coming to our work never ceases to amaze me. It never, I am in awe of the fact that someone would drive and park and, pay for dinner and, all of this to come spend a few hours with us, particularly, in Chicago, pre-COVID, post-COVID, you might have 200 choices, on a given evening. And so to me, I take that very seriously, and I always want to believe that there are new communities out there, and there are sort of these new horizons in terms of how we can reach, and digital work is part of that. Being able to think beyond a bricks and mortar location, and how do we connect to people?
Right.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Kathryn, it seems to me that New Arab American Theater Works is also very community oriented. And I would really love to hear a little bit about what that means you know, in terms of your community-based programs, you're a teacher too. Does that mean, for example, that there's a student involvement in New Arab American Theater Works?
Yeah, I mean, everything I've done in New Arab American Theater Works is the latest, has been rooted in working with the local community. And I live here in Minneapolis, and our community here has changed, and times definitely in Minneapolis have been rocky, put it mildly. But yeah, I mean, everything that we stand for is committed to working with our community in every aspect, as much as we possibly can. I mean, I had the great joy to work with Malek right before COVID hit us on a show. And that's just an example. We were casting a show of actors that were from the community with no experience acting, pretty much. I mean, I think if I think of the cast, I really, as far as the Arab actors, I really don't know if we had very many that had been even in productions before. And so this is a core belief that I've always had, is I want to work with our community to help to train them, to be a part of what we're doing, even though we might be able to find someone who looks like an Arab, for instance, who might be more trained as an actor. We're committed to working with our community, to telling the stories of our community, and really excited of what we can do going forward. Hopefully things leading up with COVID, to be able to develop more writing out of our community, playwriting out of our community. And that's the next focus that I'm hoping for in the next year, is to build a coalition of playwrights locally where we can work together to develop plays, to start out to do some readings and to produce that work, and to fill it with members of our community, and to do it in a professional way too. I mean, like you said, we hired Malek, who's a professional, came from out of town to work with us. We work with local amazing professionals. Pangea World Theater has been a theater that's been very close to us to train. That's something they've been doing for a few decades. I was actually a founder of Pangea as well. But the purpose is to tell our stories from us, for us, by us, and we of course want to have audiences from everywhere to come in and participate, etc. But my main passion and belief is that the stories need to be from our community, for our community, developed by the community. And that's what I've always stood for. Beautiful, thank you.
Malek, you're like a Renaissance man. That's how I see you. And
you're too kind.
and you're a writer and you're a director, and you're also, as I've said, the chronicler of Middle Eastern American theater. I don't know what we do without you. And my question for you has to do with where your artistic work and your anthologizing intersects with your teaching. Could you talk a little about that?
Well, I mean, I got to tell you, I'm speaking to, again, my friends and colleagues here who have been kind enough to speak to my students either in person or on Zoom many times, and I owe all of you so much for doing it. But I want my students to meet you and know you and get to hear your voice, because, again, there are too many misconceptions, and the idea that we can dialogue with people like Arab American writers or Iranian American writers, or Moti Lerner, for instance, often Skypes with us from Israel at 3 a.m. With my students. That is vital to me, because I want them to hear these human perspectives that break us away from the grand narratives that we've either been fed all of our lives through the media or through other sources. Or the misconceptions that they've grown up with. I mean, when I give lectures about Middle Eastern theater, for instance, I'll have students come up to me. I'll talk about the Tazia tradition Iran and Iraq. And students will come up to me and say, wow, I just thought those people, I thought they were just warriors, and they, they come up with all sorts of epithets that I don't really want to say, but that's exactly the perceptions that they've been given through their whole lives. And so these plays humanize whole populations, and they bring it to life in a visceral way. And they remind students that these plays are deeply personal. They're reflections of homelands that are either lost or in conflict or distant. And sometimes when my students actually step into the shoes, so to speak, of Middle Eastern characters on stage, which I really think is a valuable exercise at the university level, is having students step into those characters. They take on amazing things. I mean, I had a whole group of female actors, none of them who were Middle Eastern at all, singing in Arabic during Heather Rappo's 9 Parts of Desire. I mean, that was extraordinary to me. That was just how rich of an experience that is. So what these playwrights are doing, what these artists are doing, is they're giving us material that we can bring to our stages, so we can bring to our classrooms, so we can bring to our bookshelves, and we can share with the world. And I think that becomes a mission. It really goes beyond just teaching and writing and whatever. It becomes a mission, really,
Yes.
because we have to make these interventions if we're ever going to change the narrative.
Yes, and actually, we can talk about this another time, but I now have a course that I teach, and I teach acting students, a course in which we intersect with students in other parts of the world. So last semester we did 3 long sessions with students at Lebanese American University. And the students in New York heard for the first time the full story of the explosion on August 4th. They knew nothing about what really happened. So it was a life lesson for all of them. So I appreciate what you've said. Lameece, I wanted to ask you, you started out doing creating a theater with Mohan Nancy to focus on Middle Eastern work. Beautiful. But now it's become something super, how do I put this, central to the continuation of the narratives, by which I mean your dedication to commissioning new work. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that means to the Noor Theater, why it feels important to you to do that.
Thanks. I think that's such a good question. And there are sort of a few sort of things that sort of went down that helped us kind of frame this idea of commissioning and why it's important to Noor, and I think the community. The first is that, I am all for producing. It is very difficult to produce in New York City as a small company. You are really putting all of your resources to produce one play, right? What you hope for are co-productions and things like that, but it doesn't always work out that way. And what we were finding was that plays that we really, really loved, other, let's say, PWIs, really loved those plays as well, and they could offer the playwright more visibility, more money, more, the sort of credibility of working at the Public or Playwrights Horizons or whatever it was. And we couldn't really compete with that, even if we were doing sort of this on the ground work, which I think is a larger issue when it comes to theaters of color, where we're sort of on the ground doing the work with the community, and then the bigger predominantly white institutions sort of take those plays and sort of leave the companies, right? And where they should really be lifting sort of all of us if they can. So what I have found really valuable is we sort of decided early, I don't know, probably 5-6 years ago, is why don't we just start a commission program where we start to give money to our playwrights to create a canon of work. And, whether or not we go on to produce them or somebody else goes on to produce them, at least we are contributing to this larger sort of landscape. And I think also too, you don't make a lot of money in this business, and you pour everything to create one play. So just sort of giving the money for the sake of giving somebody a little bit of a living to do the thing that they do. It's I kind of consider it a public service, because I think the arts are so important to so many things. I mean, that's why we're all here, representation, to sort of, for us to clarify our stories, to give people sort of a break. And I think what I want to continue to do that, so that maybe over the next 10 years, we have this canon of plays that we, you know, that have gone sort of here and there. Maybe we've co-produced or sort of left to go on. I mean, we are producing a play that we have commissioned by Sevan called First Down. It's about a Muslim American NFL player, quarterback. And we're producing that in February in sort of a not necessarily co-production, but a supported production. So that's really exciting. But we will continue our commissioning program. One part of our commissioning program is for plays. The other one, which Catherine leads, is a part of something we do with Pop Culture Collaborative. And this is an organization that centers sort of marginalized voices and is trying to get those marginalized voices into the pop culture world. So those commissions, we give 3 a year. We've been fortunate enough to give 3 a year for the last 3 years to our MENA playwrights, primarily playwrights, to write whatever they want, film, television, theater. Also gives them sort of an opportunity to break into a different media. So that's really exciting for us. And we're, you know, we're in the middle of sort of beginnings of conversations of how do we create these pipelines for our writers so that they can start to sort of go into these other places, right? And I just think, you know, we all have our work cut out for us. And it's certainly this new generation of playwrights and directors and artists have something new to say and are forwarding that work. So I just think it is vital to the continuation of our work and to you know, just to some little bit of money for people to understand their value also, that they're valuable to us, no matter where that piece goes.
Absolutely, got it. I love being part of it, Lameece. I'll just say that.
Oh, and you're amazing. Just amazing.
So there's something I want to throw out to all of you, and it's a big question, and but I'll just go there, and then whoever would like to take a stab at it can do that. I'm wondering how you are feeling about whether representation and the presence of Arab American stories and theater artists is actually growing, and what needs to happen to make it more, to expand it more, besides what you are doing. Do you see what I mean? It's not like, well, I'm going to do, no, you're doing it. What else needs to happen? Malek? You're on mute.
The theater establishment needs to give space to Middle Eastern American artists, and not sensational space. And this is what I call sensational space. They will give accolades to the plays that are sensational, i.e. violent. There's something, they highlight the more unsavory aspects of our community. These are the plays that are winning Pulitzers and other awards. Whereas we have other stories that are humanistic and three-dimensional and deeply moving that are being overlooked. It's shocking to me and frustrating to me. And I really feel that the sensationalism of some of these plays that are getting the notoriety play into sometimes the most negative aspects. And when they do so, when you give an award to a play that does that, that shows an abusive Muslim man, that shows a Lebanese man who steals the only diamond that's going to help the woman escape her poverty, when you show an Iraqi man wantonly shooting an American soldier to death, and all of these plays winning high accolades. And yet all the plays by people like Lameece and Jamil and Kathy and Yusuf El-Gundi and Heather Raffo and Betty Shamia, I can make a list that goes a mile long. Their plays aren't getting these accolades. Why? There's something extremely disturbing about that. And so that is, for me, something that the American theater establishment needs to really look at in a very serious way, and to quit dodging the issue, so to speak, by going for the plays that that are flashy or have that sense of sensationalism at the cost of all of these other human stories that are being told. So for me, that's where it has to start. And, and that has to be something that's not on our backs, but on the backs of those who have the power, frankly, to make those decisions.
I mean, I'm very happy to see, for example, that in the season that was postponed because of COVID, but is upcoming, that there are several plays by Middle Eastern American women that will appear on New York stages in the coming year. And they're not, you know, the war comes into the picture, but it doesn't sensationalize the participation of the Middle Eastern characters. And I'm wondering how people are feeling about the leadership in the various stages across the country. In other words, is it also a matter of people in positions to make decisions, literary managers, artistic directors, et cetera, across the country who aren't, you know, Arab Americans and Middle Eastern Americans aren't necessarily represented very much in those spaces. Anything about that, Kathy?
Well, I agree with you. And I want to even go a step further to say that our own cultural institutions need to be funded at a higher level. So Jamil's theater, you know, the theater in San Francisco, Golden Thread, I mean, the Noor Theater, you know, New Arab American Theater Works, other organizations that are led by our community that have been developing work over a number of years. These are not brand new fledgling fly-by-night places. Established, deserve to have funding so we can be major players on the scene and not be always scrapping for money. And then, you know, we can do, as Lameece is saying, commission and produce and work with our community to develop these works in a very authentic way. And then, you know, the other theaters, yeah, I agree with you. There definitely needs to be leadership in other theaters as well. But to me, our institutions need to be funded first.
I hear you. Anything you wanted to say, Jamil, about that?
Well, I second that in a big way. And also, we're talking about a handful of institutions, and we should be talking about dozens, quite frankly. And I think that's also part of the problem. I mean, every mid-sized city across the US should have a Swana Theater Company. And, you know, part of it is a failure of what I would call, you know, sort of a broader vision on the part of philanthropic and support communities or support mechanisms, but also the dismal contribution of our states and federal government. And when you look at the budget of an institution like the National Endowment for the Arts, I mean, it is pitiful. It is disgraceful compared to other countries, proportionally speaking or not. You know, Canada, a much smaller country, gives much more money to support arts institutions and artistic creation than the US does. And so, you know, we are kind of in this position, and I've been articulating this to funders as of late, where we are, you know, there's the big companies they're too big to fail, this idea, but we're too small to thrive. So we are allowed to survive, you know, on some level, and they want us to survive, and they say that and they mean that. But, you know, I feel like we're sitting on the runway waiting to take off, and we're never in the air. And so we're in this holding pattern. And at some point, if there's going to be a recognition that, you know, the plurality of American experiences all matter, all count, and that these stories are vital to social cohesion, are vital to some sort of, you know, sense of shared place and shared identity, then there has to be greater investment. And you know, it is deeply unfair that we are asked to struggle year
Yeah,
after
agreed.
year after year, and
Yeah.
that we are, supposed to sort of settle for the margins.
Right,
So
right. We have a question in the chat, but yes, Lameece, before we
I
go,
have one quick thing that I'm noticing
Yeah.
a trend in, at least sort of in like a few New York theaters, where they're getting together with theaters of color like NATCO, the National Black Theater, to produce works. And I think I would like to see more of these larger, well-funded institutions reaching out to theaters of color across the board to produce those works for many, many reasons. Because, you have the sort of foundation of that culture, people of that culture watching it and making sure that it's well represented. I mean, you have the voices in the room, but also it's a way to sort of give more visibility to those theaters as well. It's another kind of way, I think, of raising them, instead of just sort of plucking the plays out of the community.
absolutely. Thank you.
Can I just say one word about that? I am all for partnership and agree. However, I think we have to really be careful that we are not being taken advantage of in those situations, which frequently happens. The big theater gets, multi-million-dollar grant, and they are going to bring, the little, like my theater, under their wing, and throw us on their stage and make us scrap to try to figure out how to make it work. And then in the end, go away with our database of names, and we've done all the community work. And in the end, they are eligible again for the big money, and we're left behind, which frequently, unfortunately, happens. I know in this town, I don't know if everywhere else, but that is the downfall of that kind of a situation.
I mean, It does depend. It does depend. I mean, it also kind of works both ways. We got sort of database full of audience, new audience too, when we did Food and Fudwa. But those are the things that you have to look for, Catherine. That's absolutely right, to make sure, at the beginning of the partnership, we need this, and this. And that is such a great point. And we have to keep doing that, advocating for it.
Right. So I want to go to this question because it comes from a good friend and colleague, and Linda Chapman, who was the associate artistic director at New York Theater Workshop, and thus had a great presence during Food and Fudwa. And her question has to do with, well, I'll just read it. Catherine and I, that's this Catherine, have been discussing a new home for developing work now that the Lark is folding. I'm on the loose now, so I have time to matchmake. Any ideas about how we can support the development of new work from this beautiful community? So this is for anybody who's listening in and doesn't know about this, the Lark, which has been a major play development center for many years, 27 years, and had a great focus on communities of color and a global exchange program and so on. I was the director of Middle East US Exchange. So the Lark is closed, and now theaters, but I will say this, that I'm receiving a lot of inquiries from theaters that I have connections with, who would like to know which programs they might take under their wing. So I think that's a good sign. But if you have any thoughts to share about what Linda is asking. Any idea how we can support the development of new work from this community? In the best possible scenario.
Are you kind of sorry, Malek.
Oh, go ahead, please. Lameece, please.
I mean, I think this is an interesting time to have a conversation around what, these are very early conversations in terms of sort of what the Lark was doing and how we, not necessarily take over, but maybe sort of fold in or embrace those models and figure that out and see what the funding is behind it. A lot of it is funding, right? So are there ways in which we sort of get our coalition of MENA theaters together with some of these other theaters, and there's a lot of funding that can come from a new works kind of program. And the other thing, 20 minutes per question. Sorry, I'll make this quick, but also to develop maybe even where we also develop directors. There's a whole other conversation to be had about MENA directors. And sort of giving them opportunity. And there's sort of this like, why are white people directing Middle Eastern plays, right? And there's a whole other conversation to be had about giving MENA directors opportunity to direct whatever they want. It doesn't necessarily have to be the MENA play, I don't necessarily think. But in terms of just creating program, it's about money, programs, it's about money, and I think a coalition around that could be really, really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And we're always going around with our hat in our hands, looking for donations and grants and getting passed over. It's shocking. And we need money that is directly targeted towards MENA SWANA work. We just have to. I mean, the idea that we're going to take a MENA musical and try to go to a major New York musical grant organization who may be looking for Les Miserables or Cats, and we're telling a MENA story, it's just probably not going to happen. And we've had all the rejections to prove it. So yeah, we need an organization that's targeted towards MENA SWANA work, or else we will constantly be up against it.
I have a comment here from one of the audience member saying, one way is to keep us at the table all season long, not just at the planning stages for a program or production. Just wanted to share that. Yeah. Jamil, did you want to say something?
Well, just to Linda's question, I mean, thinking of building sort of a mechanism for pairing theaters or these various efforts that are focused on Arab American and SWANA voices. I mean, that is something that I would be really interested in personally. Like, is there some kind of mechanism for larger companies to self-identify and say, we are interested in this sort of partnership. We are interested, I mean, Malek referenced his musical, and he and I have been in conversation and so forth. And this is something I've really thought about: is where is that larger company that is sort of willing to do some of the heavy lifting because they have the ability to do so. But we are bringing a cultural integrity and a cultural knowledge and expertise to the table. So I don't know if that necessarily dovetails with what she was asking, but I think it's almost like a dating game. Of finding these partners who want to invest in that way.
Right. There's in the chat, there's a one-word question. It's from Hala Baki, and basically it just says Manatma ? And Manatma, for anyone who's not familiar, is the Middle East North African Theater Makers Alliance, of which we are all part. And what about that? I mean, Malek and Jamil, you are, and Kathryn, you're all in the steering committee for Manatma. How can Manatma help, do you think?
Well, we're back to the same situation. We had to make our own steering committee, our own organization, and we have to go around looking for funding for our own work again. And so, as wonderful as Manatma is, and I'm so happy to be part of it and to be on the steering committee, I have to tell you, it is one more situation, as Kathy had mentioned, where we have to do the work, we have to do the lifting, we have to do the fundraising, and it pulls us further away from doing the art. And this is the kind of thing that that we have been doing for decades. We've been having to make our own work, make our own organizations, and go around asking for money, and it's not necessarily contributing to us being artists or scholars or whatever our particular thing may be. And this is really, I feel, as great as Manatma is, it's also in the same vein of something that we've had to do over and over again throughout our history, which is always having to promote ourselves and really beg for the crumbs from the table of joy, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, before we move on, I just want to check in with you about a couple of projects that are mentioned in your bios that I just want to know a little bit more about. For example, Kathryn, the Hour of Separation. What is that?
Yeah, well, this is a big project that I started before COVID, and now everything got upended as for all of us with COVID, where I've been, the project is to pull together basically a timeline of 100 years of Lebanese history, starting with the Great Famine of the early 20th century up until the present day, and to to tell the stories along the way of where are we as Lebanese people, where were we then, where are we now, what's happened in between, and a story from Lebanon to America, an immigration story. And for me, it's something that I started based on my own family's story, but have folded in community members here. We did a series of really enlightening workshop where we got together Lebanese people of all different backgrounds and different immigration generations to talk about their story. What was it that that they've experienced in their family. And so the idea of this play is to pull these stories back together into one piece that's going to kind of give an overarching kind of tableau of that 100 years of Lebanese history. And it comes from a quote by Khalil Gibran saying, oh my God, no, I totally forgot the exact words, but I think love does not know its own depth until the hour of separation is the quote. And so it's a very powerful quote.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I want to come to Minneapolis for that.
Yes, you must. All of you must come. And we want to bring it to you as well.
Too. It's my family too, as you know.
Yes.
Jamil, okay. The Road Less Traveled, all right?
So Robert Frost wrote a poem, Road Not Taken. And of course, the famous line about the road less traveled, we find in that poem. And I had sat with that idea for some time about what is the road less traveled, and scholars of poetry and literature have sort of taken it apart and come up with any number of interpretations over the years. And of course, the most popular one is that it is the riskier road. It is the road that entails greater challenge, maybe isolation, but it is ultimately the more rewarding. And it is about making particular life choices around conviction. So I think of the road less traveled as the road that everyone on this panel has taken, and it's really tied to the artistic process and to art making. So we have put together a group of 3 playwrights, Lameece Issaq, who is originally from Turkey, Nandita Shenoy, who is of Indian heritage, and Lyra Yang, who is of Chinese heritage, and a deviser, Reza Mirsajadi, who is of Iranian heritage. And we are working with John Eisner of The Lark, and with Cory Pont, our associate producer, and we are putting together a piece that we want to be a cohesive work of art, of theater, that has all these different component pieces and sort of interstitial pieces connecting them. And Robert Frost represents a sort of older Anglo-American tradition. And there's a certain, individualism in that poem that some of us might contest. And we tell the stories of immigrants and the children of immigrants, but who are also trying to find an American dream of some sort and trying to define that some way. And to me, that poem speaks to perhaps an older idea of the American dream. So, you know, we're calling the first cycle Poetic License, and it really is reflecting on the poem and then trying to find, you know, our own stories within that. And the hope is to produce the collection in 2023 with several satellite events. And hopefully that it will be, you know, have a life beyond Chicago. So it's sort of big and bold and all those things. We hope to invite you all to come engage it.
John is very excited about it. He really very excited. Before we go, just want to check in with Lameece about your TV script about Las Vegas and your new solo play.
Okay, well, I've been writing this solo play. I wrote a lot of it in my car last year when we were sort of stuck inside. I'd go into my car and like park it in a nice area, my carface. The piece is fictional. It's a fictional solo piece inspired by the time I used to live in a women's rooming house run by nuns on the Upper West Side. And I always wanted to explore that sort of strange existence and the sort of women that lived there, sort of this combination of community and sort of deep loneliness going on within those walls, and like a kind of interesting spirituality. So now this was a really good time to sort of explore that for me. And it's about this woman who is going through a loss and a grief and sort of evaluating her untaken path to motherhood in this sort of couched in this funny midlife crisis kind of thing. I think midlife is a very interesting and underrated, underrepresented time, especially for women. So that's sort of what, as I joked around with my friend Phaedra, I'm writing more about middle age instead of being Middle Eastern, being middle-aged rather than being Middle Eastern. To be like, you know, and sort of TV work has been really fun to kind of explore. It's so different from writing plays. We so value language in the theater, and in TV and film, you are really relying on the visual and the emotional and what a person's face is doing. And so it's a different kind of trust, because you're like, are they getting it? Let me write 10 more lines that you absolutely don't need. And sort of that's been such a valuable experience and an interesting one. And certainly I am sort of deeply obsessed with television and sort of what is happening on television. I think there needs to be a hell of a lot more room for the Swana community to sort of thrive. And I really want to see those works. So, and then, I mean, it's just like one muscle, you exercise one muscle and it gets very, very sore for a long time, and maybe it starts to build after a while, but I'm all for sort of trying these different forms of writing and seeing where they get us and sort of creating opportunities for our community for doing that. So, which obviously, no, you're such a big part of it, Kathryn, and it's wild.
Okay.
Kathryn, I think we have time for one more question before we have to wrap up. And if you look in the chat room, I think there's a question about the value of cross-cultural experience. Can you read that question perhaps?
Okay, sure, if there's time. Catherine and Malek both spoke about the value of cross-cultural experiences on campus involving Swana Arab American theater. That's becoming more difficult due to increased vigilance and sensitivity about representation in our current moment or climate. Example is, who gets to step into those shoes? How do theater educators continue the mission of cross-cultural learning while navigating anti-racism within this context, particularly if they don't live or work in the most culturally diverse places? Okay, big question. Thank you, Hala.
And take it away, Catherine.
No. That's you, Malek, that's you.
Oh dear. Well, you know, I often feel that our work is so much sometimes geared not towards Middle Eastern communities. You know, it's a little frustrating. I look at it a lot like, for instance, August Wilson versus different playwrights that work on what was the so-called Chitlin circuit, where August Wilson was speaking to these LORT audiences and trying to translate the African-American experience mainly to non-African Americans, whereas somebody like Tyler Perry is translating his experiences to Black church-going audiences primarily. And so it strikes me that we're in a very strange place in our own work this way as well. So our Arab American works are speaking mainly to non-Arab audiences, whereas Arab works like Ajyal's company in Dearborn sometimes speak primarily to Arab audiences because they're in Arabic, they have Arabic music, Arabic dancing, Arabic culture. So there's that happening. And when it comes to working in a place like Eugene or where Hala is teaching, or other places, I find myself using my teaching and my work sometimes to translate the experience to non-Arabs mainly. It's tough. It's difficult. It's a lot of people come in with preconceived notions, but the good news is that in a place like this, people are sometimes more open to hearing things than in other places where you get shouted down. So at UCLA, I gave a lecture about Palestinian performance, and I was literally shouted at by certain people who were saying this is propaganda. You're just, you're trying to sell a narrative of those people, and they're, and so, you have to work within the context that you're in. You have to do your best to educate and try to have people come to an understanding of what's actually happening. And I found that great things can occur. However, every once in a while, you'll have these interesting moments of collision where I brought in a rabbi and I brought in a Palestinian restaurant owner who often do peace talks together. And a student asked the two of them, what do you think of Hamas? And I can tell you there was the two of them were diametrically opposed in their estimation of Hamas. So what do you do then? And that leads to really fruitful conversations, and it helps students understand that there are many sides to these issues and they deserve deep exploration. So I hope I'm answering your question, but definitely when it comes to the idea of how we represent, that's always complicated, and it will continue to get more complicated as time goes on. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's going to force us all not to take the easy way out in our casting.
In terms of bringing also our stories into university settings, I'm producing a small festival that goes up in April, 2 full productions and 2 staged readings of plays all by Arab writers. And so I invite you to the Festival of Voices at Tisch School of the Arts in April 2022. And I'm going to turn this over back to Akram. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. You're amazing.
Thank you guys so much for this completely inspiring conversation and energizing conversation, despite all the difficulties. In fact, I know there was a long list of difficulties and they were real. But what is, I think, actually remarkable is what you have accomplished despite all the obstacles and the opposition. I mean, the reality is we do not live in a neutral environment. We all know this. Being Arab is being othered as at best, strange, but more frequently as alien to what America is. And what you have been doing through your work is to basically place being Arab at the heart of what America is, with all of its problems and warts. And I think that's what's really refreshing and amazing about your work, is you don't shy from the complexity of our own Arab community, which has its own issues and problems with racism, sexism, homophobia, and a variety of other things that we have to face too. So I mean, again, and I think it is in exploring these things that you allow for the full humanity of being Arab. So we're no longer just a category called immigrant or Arab, but we're actually fully human, and we're allowed to be fully human. We can stumble and fail and be obnoxious, but still have the right to be in America. We can completely be idiotic, or we can be brilliant, or we can accomplish very little, or we can be as brilliant as all you are and still have the right to be in this country. And I think that's what's amazing about your work, is you don't shy away from the complexity of what it means to be Arab. And I think we're at a rich moment in which we're exploring that in a very frank conversation, because that's still not very clear. Not too long ago, we had Safiya Al-Hilo, who is Afro-Arab, and she regards the term Arab as very problematic for all the connotation of anti-Black racism within Arab community as well as Arabic itself. And I think those are the conversations that you are having and that you're bringing to the fore. And I think it's incredibly enriching. And I cannot thank you enough, because I know you're all uber busy, to borrow from our German friends, and you have such packed schedules that you are taking time to share with us your insights, your collective decades of knowledge and understanding, your scholarly insights, but also your praxis insight. And I think that's really absolutely brilliant at all levels. I really, really appreciate you taking this time. Now I would like to conclude by turning back again to question that you all dealt with, which is fundraising. And so once again, I would like to invite our audience to help us continue this conversation as we move forward to our next webinar, which will be, by the way, with Mike Musella. Lameece was featured, I mean, obviously, he's in his brilliant new film. And he's going to be on Tuesday, November 16th. And he will be speaking about that film, of course, but also about his own career and about Arab filmmaking. And obviously, kind of like the Hollywood Shuffle film that some of you may have watched, we have a whole long list of Arab stereotypes in Hollywood. And I think Mike will be addressing some of those as well in this regard. But anyway, please, again, point your camera to this wonderful QR code and help us continue our work. And join us again when we meet with Mike Musella. I would also encourage you to visit Turath at turath2020.org. It is really a very rich exhibit about the history of Arab cultural producers that has been in this country and who have struggled. And in many ways, there are echoes. Everything that Lameece and Kathy and Jamil and Malek have said can be very much echoed by the performers, by the writers, by the singers who are not taken seriously and who are seen as quote exotic, but who actually become very much part of the American cultural fabric and landscape. And we hope to bring those stories to the fore more and more. So again, I would like to thank all the participants. A round of applause for all of them. From those of you who cannot see, but trust me, there's been a lot of applause. And thank you again, and I wish you all a wonderful evening, and we will see you again on November 16th with Mike Musella. Good night, and be well.